Well, good evening, everybody. We're a little bit past 7, so I was anticipating more traffic and it would take me longer to get here, and I got here way faster than I anticipated. So I know some of you come from a long ways, some of you from a little ways away, so we really appreciate your being here. We just want to remind you that this session is being recorded, as you can well see behind you there, and then it will be available for anyone to view on the Utah Land Use Institute website. And be one of the more or less permanent training videos that are on that site. So be aware of that. It's something you want to see again, you can see it. If you want to let other people know about it, or if somebody asks you about it, let them know. Utah Land Use Institute. The website is in your materials. You've got that you received as you came here, and that'll tell you where that's at. Just want to acknowledge as we begin that this seminar has been made possible by a generous support from the Office of the Property Rights Ombudsman in the State Department of Commerce from the 1% surcharge revenue that is collected on all building permits in the state of Utah. In case you're not aware, that 1% surcharge on building permits is collected to help fund training for building inspectors and for those involved in the development approval process, which is all of you. So the training sessions that are being put together for those groups are funded from that source of money, which the Office of the Ombudsman has deemed to be something that we have been helpful with. So we appreciate their support. My name is Wilf Summercorn. I have been around the planning game for a long time, not as long as John.
But yeah, we're about the same age, so stop that.
Yeah. I spent 27 years of my career at Davis County, and then 6 years at Salt Lake City, 5 years at Salt Lake County, and then I decided to retire, and now I'm doing this. And my wife says, "I thought you retired." And I said, "I did." And she said, "No, you didn't." So this isn't full-time, obviously, but it's certainly something that I think we have found helpful and useful. John, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Actually, I had 3 years in Davis County, way back, but most of my career was in West Valley City as the planning director and community development director. Left there in 2010 and decided to do consulting stuff, and I've gotten to know a lot of people over the last 14 years in a lot of different communities throughout the state, and really had so much more exposure to what's going on in our state as a consultant than I did when I was in West Valley. But Wilf and I just like doing things like this, so we're glad to be here.
Yeah, and when John says we like doing this, I think, if anything, we've seen the need for it. Because we get questions from people all the time. Of course, both of us have worked with planning commissions and with elected officials as well, but for pretty much all of our career. And people are really appreciative, because a lot of times they come into these jobs, most of the time they come into the job on the planning commission or even as an elected official, and one of the first things they do is they say, "What am I supposed to be doing?" And, or "How am I supposed to be doing this?" And so we have done a lot of different training programs and a lot of different programs, and we find that helpful. And just from that standpoint, we keep getting asked by people, we need more training, we need more information, we need more background. And this particular series is actually a result of that. As we were doing various land use trainings and various programs, one of the comments I kept hearing from people was, "Yeah, but it would really help if I knew what to do, because I'm the chair of the planning commission and I don't know what to do." or I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to be doing as the chair of the Planning Commission. And so after having received a number of comments like that, we thought we ought to put something together on this. Now, John and I, interestingly enough, yes, we have both been professional and staff planners for a number of years, but we both have been planning commissioners, and we both have been planning commission chairs. I am still serving on, and I'm on the Kaysville Planning Commission, which is where I live. And a couple of years ago, I was the chair there, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. But John, you were on the
Mill Creek. It's actually where I live, and they incorporated 7 or 8 years ago. And prior to that, they were a township in Salt Lake County, and I was on the Township Planning Commission for several years. I found it interesting to be on the other side of the table, Most of the time as a staff person, you're just, here, you make your recommendations, you do your reports, but you don't make the decision. It was fun to be on that side. And got elected to be the chair for a year or two, and then they incorporated, and then the city wanted my help, and I felt like being a helper and a planning commission member was something of a conflict, so stopped being on the planning commission. So.
All right. As we go through this, please feel free to ask questions or make comments if you have them. We'd even love to hear any experiences that you have had in your time serving on a planning commission or as a chair of a planning commission if you've done that as well. So please feel free. When we do that, or when you make a comment or a question, we need to either give you the microphone and let you speak, or we'll repeat your question for the mic because of the recording. Because if you don't have the mic, the people that are going to be watching this later won't be able to hear what you're asking or maybe what your comments are. So just be aware that we may say, wait, let's give you the mic, and that's the reason why. So with that, let's get into it. Let's do this. All right. Well, congratulations. You've just been appointed or elected as the chair of your planning commission. Oh boy, this is great. You'll be great. Everybody obviously thinks you're going to do a good job, otherwise they wouldn't have elected you, or maybe the mayor or whoever wouldn't have appointed you. Right? You bet. That may be or maybe not. Everybody feels like maybe you're the best person to do the job, or maybe nobody else would do it. And you kind of it by default. Either way, whatever happens with that, you might find yourself saying, why in the heck did I agree to do this? What is the deal? And how does it come about? All right. You've been to meetings. You've likely been in meetings before you were elected chair, and you've watched and observed what's happened in those meetings, and someone else is being the chair. And so you've maybe learned by just watching what the person who has been the chair, how they do things in the meeting. Are they doing it right? Are they doing it wrong? Maybe you don't know. Maybe you don't really have a clue. But that's maybe one way to learn, and that's probably the way most people learn about it. It's a lot like, I say, most people in watching sports events, right? Everybody knows better than the ref, right? You watch what the ref does, and you think, oh, man, the ref doesn't know what he or she is doing. I could do a better job than that. Can you really? Has anybody here been a referee? Ah, good, we've got some hands. I was a soccer referee for 15 years. And I always loved getting the comment from people saying, oh, man, you don't know, that's that baloney call. You just don't know what you're doing. That's really bad. And what I really have been tempted to do, and I kind of have done this a little bit later, is go up to somebody and give them the whistle and say, get out there and give it a try. See what you think. And having done that myself, after having watched referees for a while, and then stepping into it and doing it, it's a whole different ballgame. And it really is tough to really do everything that you need to do. It's kind of the same way in being a chair. Here's the interesting thing. As I mentioned, I am on the Planning Commission in Kaysville. I was on the Planning Commission for a couple of years, and then was elected as the chair of the Planning Commission. Now, I've been a professional planner for nearly 40 years and worked with planning commissions, and I've watched planning commissions operate and the chairs operate and so on and so forth, and done all of that. And when I got elected to be the chair, I thought, great, now I'll get a chance to put all I learned to work. And when I had my first couple of meetings, I kind of sat there and went, oh man, what am I supposed to do and how am I supposed to do this? This from somebody who's been in the game for a long time. So it's not as easy as you might think, but hopefully we'll give you some pointers and some things that will be useful. And even if you're not the chair, it's good to know how meetings should be running, what should be taking place, and how things should be moving forward, and be able to kind of maybe help things out as well for someone who maybe needs a little bit of that background and help. All right, first thing, when you're a referee and when you're the chair of the Planning Commission, first thing you really need to do is you need to know the rules, right? And the rules for the Planning Commission, of course, we have all of the state laws that come with it, but a lot of that is, you know, law-based and all of the things that go with that, and the staff and the city attorney worry about a lot of that. But a lot of the ways that your Planning Commission runs and the things you should be doing are contained in your bylaws. So, how many of you read the bylaws for your Planning Commission? Okay, any of you not ever read them? How many of you don't even know you have bylaws? Yeah, okay. And we have actually found that to be the case, is that we still have planning commissions out there that don't have bylaws. It's not a fatal flaw, but it sure makes life a whole lot harder than if you have those bylaws and help to guide what you do in those meetings and how the meeting is supposed to run and operate and things that should happen. As I mentioned, or as I said, a lot of folks, they kind of take a look at this and they say, oh, wow, bylaws? I never heard of it. I'm not sure if we even have any. So first thing you need to do is find out, have you got bylaws? And then if you do have them, you need to see what's in them. You need to read them and take a good look at them. Well, let's talk about what a good set of bylaws should cover. These are the kinds of things in this list here that your bylaws should cover. And there are a lot of good examples out there. John and I and others can point you to good sets of bylaws that exist with various planning commissions. If you don't have any, or if you feel like that you need some modification to the bylaws that you have in place. But these are the kinds of things you should be covering. The officers, the chair, the vice chair, if you have a secretary or what other officer you may have for your planning commission, what their duties are, how they're selected. In some cases, really the two main ways that a chair and the other officers are selected is they're either voted on by the other members of the commission or they're appointed by the mayor or the elected officials. It can be either way, and it really should be specified or outlined in your bylaws. Sometimes it's actually outlined in your ordinances. Question in back.
We do not have bylaws. Most of what you got there is covered in our land use code.
Okay,
Does that work?
the question or the comment was that they do not have bylaws, but most of these items are covered in their code. Yes, it certainly can be embodied in your code. The only problem that I really see in putting it in your code is anytime you want to make a change to those bylaws as a planning commission, you're going to have to get the council to approve it. So you're going to have a multi-step process. You're going to decide what you need to change, and then it's got to go to the council for them to change it. Whereas if you have planning commission bylaws, it's really up to you as a planning commission.
So you do not need a public hearing to change bylaws?
So the question was, you don't need a public hearing to change bylaws. Not the bylaws themselves. But if your bylaws are incorporated in your code or in your ordinance, yes, then you would have to have a public hearing before they could be changed. John?
So being a little familiar with that, the thought is, you know, you may not want in a smaller community to have a bunch of things hanging out there somewhere. okay? And you don't know where they are all the time. And so to have that in your code, that may make some sense, but Wilf's point is that it's a legislative change to your ordinances to change your bylaws, which we all ought to look at every once in a while, right? But the council would have to approve those also. So just a thought. In the smaller communities, it's really hard to have all these things that are here, there, and everywhere. All in one spot seems to help. So just, there you go.
Yeah. So just take a look again. This is not everything. This is not an exhaustive list of things that can or should be in your bylaws, but these are really critical elements, things that should be contained within your bylaws and address these various aspects of your meetings and how you operate and the way you do things. It really becomes helpful, particularly when you get in a bind and something gets a little sideways and then you're thinking, well, what do we do now? And it's always good to have those bylaws there. And as I mentioned, or as I said, other things can be included in here as well. But these are the main ones. These are the things that you really ought to have. Any questions about any of those? Any comments? Yeah, question here.
Just a real quick question. What's a typical length for a planning commission person and what's a typical length for a planning chair if it's not specified in the bylaw?
Oh, okay. So the question is, are you talking about term, the length of the term? So the question is, what's a typical length of term for planning commissioners and length of term for a chair, particularly if it's not addressed in the bylaws? Really, when you establish in your city code or ordinance, there should be a section that establishes the planning commission. Says this is the planning commission and this is what they do. And a lot of that comes directly from state code. It tells you how many members you should have and how they're appointed and how long their term is. That should be included in there so that everybody has an expectation and knows how long they're on the hook for. The chair can be included in the code or ordinance, or it can just be addressed in the bylaws. And typically, you see in a lot of places that a chair serves for a year. And then they like have an election every year. Not always. It really kind of depends on the community. But the ones I've seen, typically the length of term for a chair is a year.
But is it good to switch them out after every year, or is there a good length for that chairman to serve?
So the question is it a good idea to switch the chair every year, or is it a good idea to carry him over? You know, it really depends. Really depends on the circumstance. I know of some planning commissions where the chair has served for a long time, a lot of years, and then others where they rotate them every year. It really kind of depends. Just depends, I think, on what the preference is for the community and for the people that are involved there. John?
I just might add that some communities like at least 2 years because a lot of places it takes a while to really learn your job, right?
Right.
So maybe 2 years is a good thing. Can you be reelected? Sure. A lot of communities like to move it around within the planning commission because it's the biggest job when you're on the planning commission, right? But I think, when you think about terms in general, I know one community that's got a gentleman that's been on the planning commission for 38 years. He's an architect and still contributes a lot, so it's a good thing. And other ones that they force him off after 4, and that's that. So there's a lot of variety out there.
All right. Well, okay, you're the chair. So that means you're the boss, right? All right. I mean, not in this way. You know, when you're the chair, when you're running the planning commission, I mean, some people kind of look at the old machine politics, city government kind of thing and think, all right, I'm in charge, man. I can make all kinds of decisions and do all kinds of things. Well, that's not really what it means when you're the chair of the planning commission. And really in any role of public service. What you really should take away from that is, yes, you are in charge as the chair, but it's really a service position. It's not a position of wielding authority over everybody else. And there are some good things to keep in mind. Yes, you are in control. And like any good sports game, like as I said, like I was a referee, a soccer referee for a number of years, the referee has to have control of the game. If the referee doesn't have control of the game, things can get pretty crazy and wild in some situations. So in the Planning Commission, most of the time things run pretty well, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they get a little wild and wacky and crazy, and a good chair is going to be in control of that meeting and make sure that things happen the way they need to happen and the things get done that they need to happen. As the chair, you're the moderator or referee, really, for what's going on in the meeting and what is discussed and the interactions that happen and so on. You control the flow of what happens, when it happens, and how it happens. Really, you should be. Sometimes things get a little out of control, but that's life sometimes. But really, that's part of the role of being the chair. And really, the goal should be to get the things done. Get the business that you're there to do at that meeting, get it done. Make sure that the public is served and the applicants are served and that the business of the Planning Commission and the role that they have and the things that they need to be deciding on gets done. A chair should always have respect for everyone. All the members of the commission and the people that are there asking for approvals, the applicants, and those who may be there to comment about it or to listen in or whatever they're there for. The chair should always exhibit respect and should demand that others show respect as well. It keeps the meeting working much better, and helps to accomplish. And be reasonable. Be reasonable in the things that you require, the way things work and flow, and that's really a good big part of the role of the chair. John, any comments, or should we?
Yeah, and maybe just add the staff to that too.
Yeah.
If you have staff, right? There's just occasionally there's times where we start questioning the staff, and it's really awkward when you are a professional planner for most of your life, and then you're on the other side of the table, and your staff person is saying something that you don't really agree with, and you just have to remember that respect has to happen all around the whole time. So just something to think about.
All right. Let's start getting into the mechanics of what happens. All right, before the meeting, as the chair, one of the big things you ought to do as the chair is read the agenda and read the applications that are coming before the Planning Commission in that meeting and whatever other business that you may have. It really would be helpful if the chair knows what's coming and what is expected for those items, and so be sure to do that. In many instances, you will, before the meeting, get a staff report where your staff, I've got a whole presentation on the role of staff, but the main takeaway from that is, and the thing for you all to remember is, staff are great and staff are helpful, but staff are not the deciders. The Planning Commission is. The staff is there to help the Planning Commission. And the Planning Commission are the ones who actually make the decisions. And so be aware of that. Take a look at the information that you're given by the staff and make sure it's helping you get to where you need to be in making those decisions. Now, not everybody has staff, right? What do you do in those situations? John particularly asked to address this, so I'm going to throw this to him. What happens when you don't have staff, John? What do you do about a staff report?
Well, maybe I should ask the Deweyville people and this particular table back here. What do you do without staff?
We do a lot of extra work. We don't have any paid employees other than a secretary and a clerk. That's it for the town. And all the members of the Planning Commission have to review stuff ahead of time. We talk to the the applicants, the developers, the homeowners beforehand. We make sure that they know what they've got to present, and then we know what we're supposed to look at. You know, we've done it a couple times, and so we have to look at it before the meeting. Everything you've got there, the members of the Planning Commission do that. We do all the looking and researching and talking, so that's it.
Yeah, so in the larger staffs, you're probably going to have a staff that takes care of your permitted uses. Planning Commission maybe doesn't even see those. Does that sound familiar? Yep, okay, you got a whole list of things where that happens. Probably you all get the conditional uses, obviously rezones and those kinds of things, but I think it's interesting when you don't have staff, how do you set yourself up for that? Deweyville, they have their Planning Commission members handle the permitted uses, okay? That's, I think, a technique that makes sense. But it's a challenge, right? And it's America at its finest, where everybody's volunteering their time. So, I don't know. Yeah.
Don't you have to be careful with something like that, that you're not holding? Don't you have to be careful with something like that, that you're not holding a public meeting without it being a public meeting?
Advertising is part of that you got to do.
I mean, some of the things they're doing, if you have 2 or 3 staff members together, or
Oh,
family members
oh,
together,
okay.
you start discussing
Yeah.
issues.
Yep. I
You
get
can't
it.
discuss issues unless you're in a public meeting.
So what's the number? Is it 3 or more, or is that just for the city council? More than 2? 3, okay. So, yep, do they have to be careful about that? Yes, yes. But it sounds to me like you have designated 1 or 2 folks to do that. Okay. Yeah, we have to do enough public notices as it is. One more time, Kurt.
Yeah, we're all volunteers, so nobody's volunteering to gather in groups. It's all one or 2 guys at the most. Usually it's just single individuals.
Yeah, that is one of the things we have to all be careful about, right? So, good point. Other thoughts on that? Yep.
Isn't that ex parte communication when some of the members have access to information that others don't?
So I think that's an interesting question. In my mind, all of that is public information anyway, right? That's on that application, and they're just figuring out how to process that. But if, yeah, let's hear that too.
Yeah, all the information on all the applications, all the developer notes, all the plans are all reviewed during meetings, so it's all, like John says, it's all public knowledge anyway, and nothing's held secret, nothing's held back from the commission.
Okay, so public information, you're just sharing that and figuring out how to process. That makes sense?
Yeah, you know, you kind of raised the point about what we call ex parte communication, which, I mean, in the staff report, that's available to the public and to everybody, and so it's open information. But sometimes a planning commissioner may get contacted by an applicant outside of the meeting and say, hey, I want to talk to you about my application. And if you talk about stuff there that is not shared with everybody, it's kind of called ex parte communication. In other words, somebody's telling you something and not everybody knows about it. And that's something that you ought to have covered in your bylaws about what ex parte communication is and what the rule would be. And generally, the rule is, if somebody contacts you outside of a meeting and talks to you about a matter that's on the agenda, then when you get to the meeting, make sure you declare that. Say that, I was contacted, and this is what we talked about. So that it's clear that the information is available to everybody.
Yeah, I actually have a little example to throw your way. In Ogden, right? Yes. Anyway, when I was on the Planning Commission, we had an item come up. It wasn't too far from my house. And so I rode my bike over and up a hill to get there and check it out. And I get there and there's 10 people standing there talking about the application. And, I kind of ride up into the group and go, I can't really talk to all of you. That's the way it goes. I'm going to have to just go. So you have to be careful about that stuff. I mean, your neighbors may want to talk to you about stuff, and you just have to try and stay away a little bit. So.
And it's impossible. It's really difficult to do sometimes. I mean, like you're in the grocery store and your neighbor catches you and says, hey, I want to talk to you about this gas station application that you guys are going to be hearing next week. And you say, hey, look, but the neighbor just goes on. Says, and this and this and this. Well, great. I mean, you don't want to be rude, but by the same token, you kind of ought to say, I really can't talk to you about this right now. We'll talk about it at the meeting, but they may go on. The thing to do is when you get to the meeting, make sure you let everybody know that you were contacted by somebody and this is what you talked about. Question in the back.
Do you need to disclose who that person is contacting?
So the question is, do you need to disclose who the person is? I don't know that you really need to unless it's really relevant to the application. You could just say a person in the neighborhood contacted me, and this is what we talked about. But if it was the applicant, you might want to say the applicant contacted me, and this is what we talked about, or something like that. Question here. Oh, yes. Hang on a second.
Let me just step in. My name's Craig Call, and I'm an attorney, for what that's worth. But I just wanted to throw in the important distinction. You have legislative issues and you have administrative issues. So when there's an application for approval, that's an administrative issue unless it involves a zone change, a change to the map, or a change to the ordinance, a change to the general plan. Those are legislative issues. So when you act as legislator, advising the legislative body, there are no ex parte rules. I mean, members of the legislature talk to everybody because they're legislative. Matters of policy are open to free discussion. It's only when you're acting in a quasi-judicial or administrative role where you're supposed to be an impartial decision maker and you're supposed to respond to evidence that's presented and give everyone a chance to respond to the evidence. That's when the ex parte rules come up and the need to disclose any ex parte. That is, ex parte means you're talking to someone without someone else that needs to be part of the conversation. So you're doing it ex parte. You're not including everybody that needs to hear. So if someone comes on an administrative application and opposes, for example, a subdivision approval, those are always free of any controversy, I'm sure. So if someone comes in opposed to that, the person who asked for the subdivision is not part of the conversation. That's when it gets inappropriate. That's why we do those things in the public meetings. Or we fully disclose what we can. One of the ways to do this is to preserve the conversations in email rather than just do them over the phone, maybe taking notes of a conversation if it's oral. But email communications are easy to disclose, and that really helps preserve everyone's integrity so that you can't be accused of being partisan and one-sided about your decisions.
Right. Thank you, Craig. There was a question here.
So my question is, how does that apply when you're interacting with staff? And are those ex parte communications? And in Woods Cross, what we've generally done is if there is some extensive conversation that's taking place outside the Planning Commission meeting with staff, is we just kind of recap that during the meeting. But how would those rules apply?
The rules, particularly with staff, are not that firm. But if you're talking with staff about some things that aren't necessarily like in the staff report or that aren't coming up in the meeting, be a good idea to just say, either you or the staff to say, we had a conversation. These are kind of some of the other things we talked about with regard to this. So everybody gets the same information, gets the same background. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just, you just want to let everybody know that there's been this conversation and this is what was discussed.
I'd maybe add to that sometimes communities with staff, staff wants to talk with the Planning Commission members or the council members. And to come back to your point, you got to do that in a manner where you're not creating a meeting issue, okay? But I think making sure that that's information that is shared is really the important part of that. So hopefully that helps. I mean, you got to be able to talk to staff sometimes, right? Sometimes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
All right, so review the agenda with the staff. That's kind of what we've just been talking about. And then either you or the staff may also want to poll the Planning Commission members to make sure you got a quorum. That you got enough people coming to the meeting that you're going to have a quorum for the meeting. Frequently, staff will do that. If, you may need to ask as the chair, say to the staff, hey, would you just send out a message to all of the members and see who's planning on coming to the meeting to make sure. One of the things that helps with is, hey, if you're not going to have enough members, then cancel the meeting. And don't drag everybody out on a cold, rainy night or something and then say, hey, we're not going to have a meeting because we don't have enough members here tonight. Be good to find that out in advance. But another reason for that is to find out whether many planning commissions nowadays have alternate members. And if you're not going to have enough of your regular members there, you can pull in the alternates. And so you want to make sure that you know, and that the alternates will know, hey, we need you for the meeting tonight. Now, we really would encourage the alternates to attend all of the meetings anyway, so that they're up to speed on what's going on. But they may not need to sit with the Planning Commission and take actions and vote unless there aren't enough of the regular members there to constitute a quorum. And again, you define what a quorum is in your bylaws. That specifies the number of members you have to have in order to conduct business. All right, any other questions on that? Let us move on. All right, one of the things that we suggest about your agenda, first of all, arrange your agenda, do all of the, the kind of the mundane business, so to speak, either right at the beginning of the meeting, and that's what most do. That's where you have just the various declarations, anybody have a conflict of interest? Is there anything anybody needs to talk about? Various other things that you may do that don't pertain to any of the business agenda items. You can do that at the front of the meeting, or some of those you could do at the end of the meeting too, but kind of put them either at the front or the back. And then organize your agenda so that you separate them out by the two main functions that the Planning Commission has, administrative and legislative. Many of you have probably been through some training sessions where you talk about the distinction between those two, and Craig talked about it a little bit here just a minute ago. But a legislative item is a thing where the Planning Commission is being asked to consider like a rezone of property, an amendment to the code. There are some other kinds of legislative kinds of actions, annexations, but the main ones are like rezones and code amendments. And those kinds of items require a public hearing by the Planning Commission, and then the Planning Commission makes a recommendation to the elected officials with regard to that. Those are the rules that work for that. On administrative items, you're generally reviewing an application that is seeking approval under your rules and regulations that you already have in place. And what you're trying to determine is, does this application meet the requirements of our code and regulations? And in order to determine that, you have to look at evidence. What information has been submitted with the application to give you an idea whether they're complying with your rules or not? That's an administrative action. It's not subject to the opinion of people, as legislative items are. And those kinds of items are not required by state code to have a public hearing. Now, oftentimes in our local codes, we do sometimes require public hearings for administrative items. I would say that's not a really good idea in most cases, because what do you usually get from the public? You usually get a lot of opinion, and I like this and I don't like that. That doesn't help you make a fact-based determination of whether the application meets the requirements of the code. And so, because those two kinds of items operate under such different rules, it really is like you have one hat on and then you take that hat off and you wear another hat and you're operating under a different set of rules. Organize your agenda that way. Put all of your administrative items together, and then put all of your legislative items together, so that everybody kind of knows these are the rules we're operating now under these agenda items, because they're similar. They're doing the similar kinds of things. Okay?
Maybe just add to that a little bit. How many open up their conditional use meeting to the public? Let anybody say whatever they want to say. Even up in Cache County? Geez. Okay. So you said people come in and say they like it or they don't like it?
Yeah.
I never hear anybody say they like it.
Well, yeah,
right?
that's true. Not very often.
It's almost always, hey, this is terrible. This is going to, you know.
People who like it don't show up.
Yeah, that's right. So I think the point Wilf's making is to make your life easier. You don't have to do that. But that's a big decision, okay? You got 10 people in the audience that want to say something and you don't have them say anything. Don't let them. That's really awkward, isn't it? So just think about it, but you don't have to. This idea that everything that's a permitted use and a conditional use, you've got everything in your ordinances that you need to do that approval, okay? Even if Bob over there says, I hate this, it's still allowed in your ordinances, okay? And it's a really awkward thing, so notices that go out in your communities, you need to look at them and make sure they don't say, come on in and shoot the breeze with us. Yeah, question, sorry.
So to that point, we were in the process of eliminating public hearings for a lot of things that don't need a public hearing, to avoid that awkwardness.
So that's starting to happen statewide, I think. We are stepping away from a lot of public hearings, especially for these conditional uses. I think it's a wise thing, but let's couple that with the notice you send out. Do you need to send the notice out? There's a question for you. Technically, you don't have to, right? You have to put notices in the paper, et cetera, state notice site, whatever that's called. Rob can tell us. Does everybody know Rob over here, by the by? Rob Terry, what's your job?
Statewide Land Use Training Director.
Whew. What about that? Oh, wait a minute. What did he say?
So, my name is Rob Terry. I'm the Statewide Land Use Training Director. So I help coordinate trainings throughout the state that have to do with land use and land use law. I work out of the Property Rights Ombudsman's office. I'm the only non-attorney, so I'm definitely not as intelligent as Craig, that's for sure, who knows this stuff backward and forward. But all of the attorneys in our office, of course, deal directly with land use law, land use related questions that have to do with the law. So items in the clearinghouse, I think is the term that you're looking for, the state clearinghouse for public noticing.
Yeah. Thank you, Rob. So I was just going to maybe emphasize that one more time. Do you have to mail out? The answer is nowadays you don't, okay? If you're going to, make sure that notice says something that doesn't make it like a yay or nay kind of a thing, okay? It's more of a, this is something we're going to allow, we may put some conditions on it, that kind of thing. So, yep, sorry, yep.
On item 3 here, it says public comments for items not on the agenda with an asterisk. Doesn't that open us up to even more of what you're saying not to do?
Not for anything on the agenda. So yeah, you don't have to do that necessarily either.
Yeah, you don't have to.
But a lot of communities like to let people come in and talk about anything and everything, as long as it's not on the agenda. Yep, Kurt?
We always do that just to encourage. We always have a public comment at the end of the agenda to encourage the public to be there. However, we've specified very clearly that they're limited to 3 minutes,
Yeah.
and that's it. And we don't have to, no matter what they say, we don't have to answer them. We don't have to address it. We just get to listen to it.
Yeah, a lot of places, they feel like that it's something they've done for a long time. Public kind of seems to expect it, so they continue to do it. But some places don't feel that there's really any value in it, and they don't do it. It's nothing you have to do. It's really up to you whether you want to allow doing something like that or not.
Once again, I just can't resist the temptation. Just another thought here, and that is, in administrative issues, we have a duty to respect due process. And the applicant and the city are not the only ones that might have due process rights. So let's say, for example, we're considering a conditional use to build a gas station next to a nursing home. Just say. The guy who owns the nursing home, or someone who's in the nursing home, or who cares deeply for someone in the nursing home, may have a due process right. They have a protected property interest in what's going on next door, because the conditions, if they're not correctly imposed, might allow a common law nuisance. And we have the legal right to protect ourselves from what rises to the level of a common law nuisance. So as we decide who can speak, there's kind of three categories. The people that clearly have the right, that's the applicant and the planner, the city staff. People that clearly don't have a right unless it's a public hearing, and that's just the general public. And then you've got those folks in the middle. If it's a next door neighbor and you're considering something that might affect the quiet enjoyment of their property, then I wouldn't want to be the one who tried to explain to a judge why we wouldn't hear the person who may have a protected property interest in the outcome. These rules are not as hard and fast as sometimes we think. Just because we have a public hearing, we didn't designate a public hearing, doesn't mean that only the Planning Commission and the staff can speak. It's a matter for the chair to decide. And in the case of someone who may have a protected interest, I'd certainly recommend you err on the side of hearing what that person has to say.
But it's not a yay or nay thing, right? It's evidence, something you might not have known about the property next door. I had a hearing, actually it was a public meeting in Mill Creek, where we had a bunch of townhomes going to be built, and apparently there was an irrigation ditch that went right through the middle and onto the properties beyond, down the slope, and nobody had picked that up. And so we learned about that from a very angry user of that ditch. You guys never argue about water rights, do you? Okay. Anyway, it was just this one of the ones where we had to bring a police officer in for a moment or two. So, anyway.
Well, and that's part of the art, I guess I'll call it, of being the chair. Because even though for an administrative item, you may not require a public hearing, and really the public has no right to speak at that item, as the chair, you really do have some discretion. And you may be able to say, you know, that person there looks like they may have information that it might be useful to have on this item. Let's go ahead and let that person make some comments to us. It's not that they have a right to speak. It's not a public hearing. But the chair may say, you know, as Craig said, they may be affected by what we're going to do here, so we maybe ought to hear from that person. And so it's really kind of more of an art than it is a fast rule. Okay. It's time for the meeting. All right? And you're the chair. First of all, certainly get there on time, but even try to arrive a little early. For one thing, you can talk to the staff a little bit beforehand and find out if there are any changes to any of the agenda items, or if there's anything else that you need to know or that the Planning Commission is going to need to know about, so you can confer with them a little bit before the meeting starts. Whatever you do, try to start that meeting on time. People have that expectation. People have, time, have commitments. Get your meeting started on time. It just shows that you're being conscientious and acknowledging people that are there at the meeting for a variety of reasons. welcome the members of the commission, welcome the visitors that are there, and then indicate the agenda. And if there are any changes, sometimes a common thing that you see happen every so often is that somebody has asked because they either need to leave early or can't come till later, they've asked that you switch agenda items around. So let the public know. If there's any kind of a change to any of the agenda items, let the people know right up front, here's our agenda and we've got to change. So that everybody's aware and they know what to expect. And then take care of business. Do your approval of the minutes. Ask the planning commission members if they have any declarations of conflict of interest on any of the items. Have they had any contacts or anything that they need to talk about? You can do that during the specific agenda items as well, but you could also do some of that up front. But take care of a lot of those kind of taking care of business kind of items, and then you go on to the agenda. Now, one thing that it is oftentimes helpful to do as a chair is to explain to the public the difference between administrative and legislative items so that the public knows what to expect. You know, now we're going to go to a request for a rezone. This is a legislative item. Legislative items work under these rules. And we have to have a public hearing, and we want to hear your opinions and your thoughts on this. Then we're going to do an administrative item. We're going to have a conditional use permit or a site plan review approval or a subdivision plat approval. In that case, that's an administrative item. We're not required to have a public hearing. What we're doing is we're checking to see if this application meets all of the requirements of our code and ordinance. And if it does, we're obligated to approve it. If it does not, then we can deny it. But it depends on the information that we get, the evidence that's presented, whether that application meets the requirements of our rules or not. It's really a good thing for the chair to explain that to the public because it can help the public to understand how come you're doing things on this one this way and how come you're doing it different over here for that one. You know, that it's not just something at the whim of the chair of the commission. For the reason that they're doing that. So, always a good thing to do. Question over here.
Thank you. If you're rearranging the agenda during the meeting, does that require a motion and everybody to decide whether or not to do that?
It really depends. Depends on your bylaws. Specify that in your bylaws. That if you're going to change the order of the agenda or take items on or off the agenda, it requires a vote of the commission or that the chair can do it. There's no hard and fast rule there. Be good for you to indicate how you want to have that handled.
Yeah, you can give the chair a few more responsibilities here and there if you want. So, like opening and closing meetings, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
I was just going to add, how many have some sort of, I'll call it a preamble, that you read before the meeting starts? Yep, a couple of you. Murray does too. Okay. Yeah, we had one in Mill Creek, and I, honestly, as a chair, I sort of hated just reading that thing. But nevertheless, it was really helpful. We started, when we have shorter agendas, to put it on the back of the paper copy too, so that people could read and understand a little bit better what's going on and how the meeting gets run. So just something to think about. I think it's useful, that explanation of legislative versus administrative. That's a tough one to get through in 3 minutes or whatever the time is, but may as well try. So.
Yeah, and Rob, my understanding is that your office has been working on kind of a declaration of rights and procedures that are going to be made available to all of the communities around the state to have.
Yeah,
and
attorneys right now are just finishing their review. The attorneys are just finishing their review on that right now, and then of course we'll have it laid out in a form that puts it in as much plain language as possible. And then posted, it'll be not only available on the Property Rights Ombudsman website, but also on the Land Use Academy of Utah, which is a great resource for planners throughout the state, and is currently being updated as well to have even more content and everything in it as well. So some really good changes coming up here this year in particular.
How many have gone to that luau site occasionally? Okay. You had a nice party there at the luau? No. Yeah, that updating that, I think, is a terrific accomplishment by Rob's office when they get it wrapped up, because a lot of good information there. You all familiar that you have 4 hours of training every year?
Right.
That you're responsible for, and you can get most of that through the luau site, so.
Right. Okay. Let's talk about the, you're on to your agenda items. This is a good suggested procedure, way to go about your agenda items so that you kind of cover all of the bases. And again, this would be something good to include in your bylaws, saying this is the procedure that we follow for the business agenda items. The chair, introduce the item and explain the Planning Commission's role. In other words, we're going to hear now the application for a rezone of property. The Planning Commission's role will be to make a recommendation to the City Council whether to approve the proposed rezone or not. Have the staff give a presentation on it, allow the members of the Planning Commission to then ask questions, then have the applicant come up and address it and make his presentation. Planning Commission members ask questions there. Now, at this point, when a public hearing is required, and it's usually required for all legislative items, hold your public hearing. This is when you hold the public hearing, and we'll talk about some of the details of holding public hearings in just a minute, but now's the time, good time to hold your public hearing and get that input that's required. After you finish with the public hearing, close the public hearing, then give the applicant time to come up and respond to comments that were made during the public hearing. Then allow the Planning Commission to discuss what they've heard from the public comments, from the applicant's response, from staff. At that point, you may be ready for an action. The Planning Commission action is a motion, discussion on the motion, and a vote. And after the vote is taken, then the chair will announce the results. In other words, the Planning Commission has voted to recommend approval of this rezone application, and this will be forwarded on to the City Council, something like that. So just a good set of procedures, a good order to follow, and kind of make sure that you touch all of the bases. Any questions about any of that? John?
So what do you do if you don't have that second item there? I'm going to just keep going back here to Deweyville. You don't have a staff presentation.
We skip the staff presentation, and we jump right to the applicant presentation. We get most of our information from the applicant themselves, and any interaction we've had, our secretary and our clerk, they deal with the applicants before they get on the agenda, so they gather information. And then any questions we have, we take care of it right there, talking to the applicant.
So skip the staff, don't have any. Let's go to the applicant for that information. So that's good. Okay.
All right. Let's move on now and talk about a public hearing versus a public meeting. All meetings that you have as a planning commission are defined or categorized by state law as a public meeting. What that means is the public is allowed to attend your meetings and see and hear what you're doing. That's true of any public body in the state of Utah, councils, boards, all kinds of public bodies, and a planning commission is considered a public body under state code. And so your meetings are required to be open to the public. What's not required is that the public has a right to speak. Now, some people think that's really kind of antithetical. It's like, wow, really? Isn't that what the whole purpose of government is to hear from people? But under state code, there are certain things that require what is called a public hearing. And in a public hearing, the public does have the right to speak. For the items that the Planning Commission considers, any legislative item is required to have a public hearing before the Planning Commission. So rezones, like we had already mentioned, rezones, amendments of the code or ordinance, annexation petitions, a few other things that are there. Those kinds of items you are required to have a public hearing on. Now, what does it mean when you have a public hearing, and how does it differ? All right. As we mentioned, or as I just mentioned, those legislative actions, the Planning Commission is required to hold a public hearing on those. And as we've already talked about a little bit, administrative actions, things like conditional use permits, site plan approvals, subdivision plats, a variety of other things. State code does not require that you have public hearings for those. You really can do that without any public comment at all. Now, we talked a little bit about whether that's a good idea or not, and it really is at the discretion of the chair to decide whether they want to allow anyone to make any comment. But some communities do require, in their code or ordinance, do require that a public hearing be held on some administrative items. It's something that comes from way back when, and many codes and ordinances still have them. And if your code or ordinance does have it, you better hold it. You better hold the public hearing, but you may want to consider taking it out of your code or ordinance because it's not required by state code, and it allows the Planning Commission chair to have a little bit more discretion about whether and when it's appropriate to allow some people to comment on an administrative item and whether there's any value in doing that. All right, so just to be aware of that. The issue with administrative items is administrative items cannot be decided by what we call public clamor. That term actually comes out of a court case for a situation that was from right here in Clearfield. And lo and behold, I was the planner in that situation. Great fun. But essentially what the court said is that on administrative items or on items like that where the applicant has a right to approval if they meet all of the requirements of the code or ordinance that they're applying under, public clamor is to play no role. The opinion and the role of the public is not to play any role in that because it's based on opinion and not fact, not evidence. And so that's always a hazard when you're having public hearings for administrative items. Administrative items must be decided or judged on the evidence that's presented, whether they meet the requirements of the code or not. And we'll talk about as you get to making approvals that you ought to cite what that evidence is. So in case it's challenged, which it can be, that you've listed right there, here's the evidence that we've got, why we think it meets the requirements of the code or ordinance. Question here.
How does that apply to the conditions that you might create on conditional use items?
Yeah, as far as conditions go, so for conditional use permits, you are allowed to, for a situation where it is determined that there's an impact that may have a detrimental impact on nearby other properties or property owners, you can impose conditions, but those conditions have to be things that you've outlined in your code or ordinance and that you can do to mitigate the potential impact that a use may have. Now, you may determine that it may have an impact and it may not. A good example, I think, sometimes is a gas station. If you have a gas station and it's slow and it's a conditional use and the neighbor next door is a tire store, not a lot of impact, really. I mean, you already have cars coming and going to the tire store, and so whatever impact you may have from the gas station, there's probably not a lot there that you have to mitigate. But let's say that the next door property to the gas station is a hospital. Okay, now you may be having some impact on that property, on that hospital. So what kind of things can you impose? And your ordinance should outline what kinds of things that you can require or what kind of things you can put a condition on, like lighting, so that it doesn't bother people in the hospital or in the adjacent use or be beyond a certain intensity, or odor, you know, the smell of gasoline or whatever, and whatever can be done to mitigate that, and other impacts. But those are the kinds of things, it's not things you can just kind of come up with out of the air. You do have to have some standards within your code or ordinance that says we can require these kinds of things when it's warranted, when it's justified. And that's what you're determining when you're considering a conditional use permit. John?
Yeah, so that one's actually an interesting one where certainly you can have standards for lighting, right? You have nothing that goes beyond the property line. Or a lot of communities now are doing the down lighting so that we have dark skies at night, those kinds of things. Those are some good standards, but maybe with the gas station, they have that car wash associated with it, right? And it's noisy, and so you might want to impose hours of operation. So generally what I'm seeing the communities do is put in their conditional use chapter a list of other things to consider that you might want to impose. The other side of that is for every use you've got out there, you almost have to figure out every single standard you want to apply, period, which I think is a pretty tough task. It's easier to say we might want to add these things, okay, as opposed to for this use, we've got it all specified. There's no point in it being a conditional use then, just be a permitted use, right? Does that make sense?
And if you're going to impose conditions, make sure that you cite what evidence that you have and put it in the record. Put it in your motion, that this is the evidence that you have of the impact and this is what you're requiring to mitigate that impact. And that becomes part of the record, part of the motion when you approve it or deny it.
Okay. So you
Okay.
can make it really complicated, and every single use you have every standard you could ever think of, or you could make a list and say that on some of these we may have to impose something additional. So,
I understand. My question has to do with how does the public clamor? My question is kind of how does the public clamor piece of that come in? For example, somebody's going to build a building on a particular site. It's a conditional use. The neighbor says, well, that's going to be too tall. It's going to cast shadow. I'm going to get ice all over my property. But it's a conditional use that they're asking for. So now we've had that neighbor, the public, speak up to say, this is an issue for me. And then we say, all right, well, we can approve this building, but one of the conditions is you got to put this on the south side of the lot instead of the north side of the lot. You need to flip the building in your parking lot. Well, have we then just made a condition based on the public clamor that we got from the neighbor? So where does the public clamor, I mean, it's not that picture where everybody wants to speak up. There's certain people that have that particular interest, so then we create conditions to accommodate that interest for that person that spoke up. Is that us allowing public clamor to drive an approval?
yeah, I think just because they speak up, it's not necessarily public clamor, right? If they can show you that they're going to be in the big shadow of some sort, that's evidence, right? And you may be able to adjust the site plan to do that.
I think about the example that John just gave about the ditch going through the property that nobody knew about. You know, that wasn't public clamor from that property owner that came to say that. It was evidence. Hey, look, there's a ditch going through that property you don't know about. And I'm going to get affected by this if you don't do something to take care of that. That's evidence. That's not just clamor.
Even if they're yelling, right?
Yeah, even if
okay.
they're yelling.
Yeah.
But doesn't that have to be supported by your ordinances with setbacks and height restrictions? Wouldn't that have to be, that situation would have to be supported by those ordinances, which would give you, I'm asking, wouldn't it have to be?
Yeah. I mean, you're going to have setbacks in height, right, is part of that. And so, yes, they could go there, but if it's some kind of major imposition that, you know, there's some evidence for, yes, you could massage the site plan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's move on. We don't want to keep you here too long. We've already been here a little over an hour. So, but by the same token, we want to make sure that we get all of your questions answered. All right. Public hearings. You've all been in them, right? They're a lot of fun, right? Most of them are pretty easy. Most of them, you know, how many public hearings have you had where nobody shows up? Or one or two people show up, right? And it's pretty easy. You know, come on up, tell us what you want to tell us. Okay, thanks very much, we're done. But then there are those, right? Where the room is packed and people are not happy. And they want to let you know in no uncertain terms what the hell they think about what you're trying to do here. How do you manage that as a chair? How do you deal with that? There are some good guidelines and some good things that you can consider. Again, these might be the kinds of things that you want to include in your bylaws, but some good things to consider for whenever you do have a situation where things are really looking pretty feisty and you've got to have this public hearing and people, you know, are just they're gonna lose it. They're gonna get out of control. Various things that you can do. The most obvious one is the time limits thing. You know, tell people they have a time limit and really try hard to stick to it. What if somebody goes over their time limit? You know, I don't know, it's tough to do, but really try to stick to it as much as you can. Have people sign up to speak so that everybody has an expectation of who's coming and what they're going to say. Alternate pros and cons. You know, those who are in favor of it, those who are against it. Unfortunately, a lot of the times nobody's there to speak in favor of it. They're all there to speak against it, so that may not work. Ask people if it's a big group and you know that a lot of people are just going to say the same thing, ask the group to appoint a spokesperson and hear from that spokesperson, and that will kind of summarize everybody's points. And then ask people, you know, if the spokesperson said what you are thinking and what you wanted to hear, don't come up. But if people really want to come up, you really do need to let them talk. It's not really like you can say, we already heard this, sit down, shut up. People really do have the ability, have the right to come up and tell you what they think. Ask people not to repeat comments. You know, please, we've already heard that comment several times now. Please, we don't need to hear it again. Please, no outbursts, because they oftentimes intimidate people. They make the meeting go longer. You know, really ask people to kind of maintain respect. Don't respond directly to questions. That's an important part of this, because then you can really get into these back and forth matches that can really destroy the character and the order of the meeting. If people have questions and they're asking questions, as a chair, your response is, okay, thanks, we've made a note of your question. We may address it later. But don't get into a debate with people right there during the hearing because they want an answer to a particular question that they've got. If things really get crazy, bang your gavel and say, we're recessing for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever. Gives everybody a time to sit down and cool off a little bit, and sometimes it actually lets people get more mad, but situation you ought to read a little bit. So, question over here.
It's actually just an experience I wanted to share really quick.
Yeah.
Recently, we did have an outburst in our planning commission meeting. And for a moment, it was hairy because the lady came in just really in a huff with very little context and kind of broke the rules of order, you know, tremendously, hijacking the meeting. And our chairman asked the planner to take the lady aside in another room and explain, or you know, at least ask what her concerns were privately while we continued the meeting. And you know, 15 minutes later, she came back in and exited the meeting peacefully, and you know, but for a moment there was a little bit of chaos, but I felt like our chair really did a good job of handling it.
You know, there really are a lot of different ways to try and handle it, and a lot of times you just kind of have to read the situation and what you think is going to work and what's not going to work. So, but you know, these are just some general suggestions that seem to work in many situations.
Let me offer an example of one time I thought it really worked well. And we on the Wasatch Front think we're pretty fancy and sophisticated. This was East Camas, East Summit County Planning Commission in Camas, a really controversial subdivision going on out in the middle of the fields. And the chair came in off the dairy farm, the milking was done, and sat down in front of the group and said, this is how we're going to do this. The applicant's going to explain what he's doing. then we're going to take the time we need to listen to the questions that come from the audience. Please ask questions. If you have conclusions, offer them, but please focus on the questions. Now, Mr. Applicant, I want you to write down every question you hear. And at the end of the public comment, we're going to have you repeat it. And then we're going to hold another meeting in 2 weeks and want you to come back with answers to the questions. Is that okay? Everybody was fine. 2 weeks later, we met again. The applicant responded to the questions. The chair said, okay, what other questions and what's not resolved? He did that twice. When the subdivision was approved, nobody came from the public. It had been a very fine back and forth conversation in an orderly, respectful way. And one of the keys to this, folks, is don't set a deadline that you're going to take a vote the same day as the hearing if you can possibly avoid it. You're creating artificial pressure. And people scream and shout because they don't feel heard and they feel like it's urgent. But that's artificial. You can certainly show that they're being heard, even if the chair repeats back the questions instead of the applicant when it's over. That really is a powerful tool for what that's worth.
No, great example, Craig.
And that would be especially for legislative items, right? Okay.
I'm just curious, we are a small town and we meet once a month. So when we say we're going to come back with someone, for some developers, for some applicants, 30 days is a long time. And if we push them back for 2 meetings, that's another big, especially when you have a specific, when winter doesn't end until March or April and, it starts again in October, those months go by pretty quick. I'm curious how many times everybody else meets.
I'd say most planning commissions, or a lot of planning commissions, meet twice a month, every other week. Some do meet only once a month, particularly in smaller communities or communities where they don't have staff. If that is an issue, you can certainly call a special meeting and say, okay, we're not going to decide this tonight, but we want to address this in a special meeting, and we'll set up a special meeting for 2 weeks from tonight, or do something like that. And then, of course, you have to go through the process in order to do that with doing the notification and everything else that goes with it. But, and specify in your bylaws what you have to go through in order to set up a special meeting. But that's certainly a way to address that if you've got such a normal long time between meetings. That's certainly a possibility. All right. This is from Washington State, organization there that does a lot of work in assisting local governments with planning-related issues. And this is something from their book about strategies for managing difficult public meetings, and just some good suggestions. Lay out some ground rules right up front. Tell the public, this is how we're going to proceed. This is what we're going to do. Again, the no back and forth dialogue. When people ask you questions, don't feel like you have to answer them right then. The response would be, we're taking note of your question and we'll address it later. Something along those lines. Explain the limits of your legal authority. People may be really mad about something that you're doing, but you may have no ability to either do it or not do it. And explain that to the public. When they say, you just should not approve this conditional use permit. And it might be good to explain to the public, the only time that we cannot approve a public or a conditional use permit is if there's no way to mitigate any of the potential impacts. If we can do something to mitigate it, we're obligated to approve it, but we cannot approve it, not approve it. And just explain what your legal authority limits are. Taking a break is, like I say, just recess. It's always a good way to try and calm things down a little bit. You may get to the point where you have to have somebody removed from the meeting. Really try to avoid that, because it really causes a lot of pain and agony and a lot of other things. But it does happen on occasion that somebody is just not going to let you get on with your meeting. They're just not going to. In which case, hopefully you've anticipated that and you have an officer of the law or someone there that can remove that person from the meeting. If you get into a situation and you don't have anybody that can do that, adjourn the meeting. Just say, we're done for tonight. And we'll pick this up again in a subsequent meeting or something like that. And another thing to do is to explain to people what your next steps are. And as Craig already mentioned, and others have mentioned, oftentimes it's a good thing to delay the action that you're going to take to the next meeting. Don't do it that night. Give everybody time to calm down, think about it, do whatever, and you're going to make the decision at a subsequent meeting. You'll get answers to questions that have been asked. It allows you to do a lot of things. There's a lot of value in controversial and hot meetings saying, all right, thanks. We appreciate everybody being here. We got all your questions and comments. We're going to take it under consideration, and we're not going to take any action tonight. We'll likely do that at our next meeting. So something like that. Question back.
So does the chair decide that, or is that a motion?
The question was, does the chair decide that, or is it a motion? It can be either. It really can be either. The chair could say, all right, we're not going to take action on this tonight. And I think that's within the purview of the chair. But one of the planning commission members could say, I think we ought to not make a decision on this tonight, and I would make a motion that we either table this or delay action on this until the next meeting, and then get a second on the motion, and then take a vote of the entire body. Would be appropriate to do that. John?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a quick note on the police officer part. Sometimes just having a police officer present or able to show up at the meeting is enough to quiet people down. It's amazing. The guy with the irrigation problem, essentially we had the cop show up and he got much quieter. So that was a good thing. Another example I had years and years ago, this one gentleman would not stop talking, just would keep going, you know, even though we had the 3-minute rule and all that kind of stuff, just wouldn't sit down. So we had to have the police officer come in and actually remove him. I think it's nice, who mentioned the staff person maybe trying to help out and bring him out and talk about the issue outside the meeting, but sometimes that doesn't work. So there almost has to be like a standby cop somewhere. And I don't know where you get that in Deweyville. But I do think that the presence and ability to have somebody like that show up is helpful occasionally. Okay?
All right. Let's quickly cover. All right, you're done with all of the falderall, all of the thising and thating and foring and againsting and everything else. It's time to do something on this agenda item. It's time to approve, disapprove, whatever it is that you need to do, make a recommendation or whatever. So these are generally the kinds of motions that you will do in a planning commission. These are based on Robert's Rules of Order, but people say, well, we operate under Robert's Rules of Order. No, you don't. Most bodies like planning commissions and councils don't operate. Has anybody looked at a full-size Robert's Rules of Orders book? I mean, what that's really intended for is for things like state legislatures and Congress. It's not intended for a small body, but there are parts of it, aspects of it, that work very well in meetings of smaller bodies. So these are the kinds of motions that you will generally consider in a planning commission, to approve or to deny or to table an agenda item. And when you do any of those, it's really a good idea to have findings with that. I make a motion to approve this application because, and then cite the evidence, the information. It's in the staff report. You know, the staff report has listed the information. We determined that that meets the requirements of our code or ordinance, and it's right there. Or other things you may have heard during the meeting, or information that you've gotten. But include that information in the motion. Another kind of a motion is to amend. So somebody makes a motion, you get a second on it. After you talk about it for a little bit, maybe you need to change that motion a little bit. Well, there's another motion that someone can make to amend the motion. And then you go through a second and approve that as well. or to completely substitute the motion. You know, somebody made a motion to approve, I think that's wrong. I don't think that's where we want to go. I make a motion to substitute another motion to deny. That's appropriate. It can be done as long as it gets a second. When you take a vote on those, or get ready to take a vote, the vote on the substitute motion is done first. And then depending on what happens with the substitute motion, you may go back to the original motion. A motion to reconsider. So now you've gone through, you've had a motion, you've taken a vote on the motion, and all of a sudden somebody gets a second thought about it. They go, man, I don't know if that was the right thing to do. I make a motion to reconsider our previous action on this item. Under the rules that are specified, you have to look at that, but that can happen as long as you're still in the same meeting. But once you close the meeting, it's over. You can't have any more motions to reconsider. All right, so just be aware of that. And you ought to outline all of these in your bylaws about how they work. A motion to do a recess, a motion to adjourn, a motion to open and to close hearings. Some places do require motions to open a hearing and then to close a hearing. Others just let the chair do it. But again, specify that in your bylaws and in your rules. But that's generally, that's 99.9% of the kinds of stuff you're going to deal with as motions in your planning commission. Likely not to have a lot of other things. John, you're looking,
I was just going to toss in one thing I've seen in a few places, and just want to talk through the logic of this, but right up at the front of the agenda, there's a motion to accept the agenda.
Oh, yeah.
What do you think of that? You know, whether you should accept the agenda as written, that's already been noticed. You're getting my opinion. It's already been noticed out there. It's already out there. And we're going to accept that agenda or not? What does that mean if you say not? What's that? Sorry, that was...
Close the meeting and renotice.
Close the meeting and
Might
renotice.
be one way, walk away. But yeah, I don't follow the logic of that, actually, that you've put out in all the notifications you needed to do, mailed out here and there, and then maybe you don't accept the agenda that you've already put together. I don't know. Yeah, thoughts? Sorry. We'll let you put your thoughts on record here.
In answer to your question, I feel like it's kind of like a two-step process, because the staff creates that agenda. You know, they've written it up from the previous meeting, and as a planning commissioner, we review that agenda prior to the meeting that we're to accept it. And a lot of times, there are some errors there that us as planning commission have found, and request to amend the record before we officially accept it.
Minutes.
Oh,
That's different than the agenda.
We find errors on our agenda once in a while.
yep, that's true. Yeah, whether it's minutes or agenda, we've had errors in both.
Okay. So that would be amending the agenda, right? But not necessarily not accepting it, right? It's almost like this vote that starts the whole meeting off, like we're going to go through these items or we're not. Now, you might have had a change, like Wilf mentioned earlier. Maybe an applicant can't make the meeting, and you want to move that around on the meeting, or you have to push that off to next week. But, you know, you've really sent that notice out already. So I'm just raising that. It's just, for me, it doesn't necessarily make sense, but amending the agenda does, if you need something modified. So.
Can the chair make motions?
Question is, can the chair make a motion? Depends on your bylaws, once again. Normally, chairs don't make motions, but you really ought to specify in your bylaws whether the chair can make a motion or not.
Yeah, I'd say usually not.
Usually not.
Chair to break a tie.
Well, we'll talk about that. That's
Okay,
coming
it's
up right
coming up,
now.
coming
In
up.
fact, we'll go there. Voting.
Question in the back.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I had one question on the,
Yeah.
can you give an example of a substitute motion? Like, say there's a motion to approve something and it gets a second, and someone makes a substitute to not approve and it gets a second, I guess is that how it works? I've never had a substitute motion before, but I'm just curious, what would you do in that circumstance?
Yeah, it certainly can happen that way, and I have seen it happen that way. Usually you have discussion on the motions, and then you take a vote. And the normal rule for the order is you vote on the substitute motion first. And then depending on what happens with the vote on that substitute motion, then you go back to the original motion. If the substitute motion fails, then you're back to the original motion. If the substitute motion passes, you're done, and you don't consider the original motion any longer.
Remembering that you have to have a second on the substitute.
You have to have a second, that's
Yeah.
right.
Yep.
Usually specify that. All right, voting. Now we get around to voting, all right? Usually the vote is called by the chair, but there is one of those rare exceptions that I've talked about. It is possible that a member of the commission can call the question, it's called. Say, all right, look, we talked about this long enough. I think we ought to have a vote. Call for the question. Now, you ought to specify in your bylaws what it takes in order to allow someone to do that. Is it a motion? Does that person have to say, I make a motion that we call the question now, and do they have to have a second? Or can a member just simply say, call for the question? And then does it have to be honored by the chair? That the chair says, all right, we have someone who's called for the question, we have to take a vote now. Specify that in your bylaws about how that might work. Call for the question. What that means is you're saying, we're debating now what to do on this agenda item, and we've talked about it, so what do we do now? And the chair may just have said, I'm not ready for a motion yet, or hasn't asked for a motion, and one of the members says, I think we're ready, let's move on. Call the question. Ask for a motion, let's move on with this. And so kind of specify. A lot of places will allow any member to ask for, to say, call the question, and then the chair would have to say, all right, well, then we're ready. Is there a motion?
You have to have a second on that?
You ought to specify that, whether you want to allow that or not, or require that or not. In most voting, the majority rules. You ought to specify if there's a minimum number of votes that are required, because you may have some members of the commission that abstain from voting for whatever reason. They may have a conflict of interest, or they just don't feel like they want to vote on this particular motion. So you should talk about, do you have a minimum number of votes required? Sometimes, when you have a quorum, let's say you have a 7-member commission and you say a quorum is having 4 members there, do you have to have 4 positive votes in order for the motion to pass? Or do you only have to have 3 of the 4 vote? Really you need to specify that in your bylaws as to how that's going to work. Does the chair vote? Some places allow the chair to vote just like a regular member. Some places say the chair only votes in the case of a tie. Specify that in your bylaws as to what the chair does on the voting. If a vote winds up tied, and it all depends too on what you will allow or what the chair does as far as voting, but if you get to a vote where it's tied, then the rule generally is the motion fails. The motion fails. It has not passed. So, but again, specify that in your bylaws so that everybody's clear on that. Can a member change their vote? Yes, they can change their vote until the final result is announced. All right, so let's say you take a vote and it's 4-3, all right, and the chair's going, okay, looks like we have a vote here of 4-3, all right, and then one of the members says, wait, I want to change my vote. Chair hasn't announced the results yet, it isn't over, so a member can still change their vote at that point. Once the chair has announced the result, generally then, if the member wants to change their vote, they would have to make a motion to reconsider and see if that then would be seconded, and then there would be another vote on that. How the vote is taken. A lot of people don't think about this, and I have a whole nother presentation that talks about the influence that we have on each other whenever we're making decisions, especially in small groups. Do you do votes sequentially? In other words, you go person by person and ask for their vote? Or do you have everybody vote at the same time? All in favor say aye, all opposed say nay. What's the best way to do it? Research shows that sequential voting oftentimes results in members being affected by those who voted before them. And that's because when you think about it, a lot of times people may be sitting there thinking, oh man, I'm not really sure how I feel on this thing. And then you start the vote, aye, aye. And this member goes, well, I might as well vote aye. I don't want to be the odd man out. And so they vote aye. That may not be what they really think, but they don't want to be left out or they don't want to be different. So considering how to do that is an important consideration. Think about how you want to take the vote and have it counted. And then recognize that state law requires that each vote must be recorded in the minutes. The vote of each member must be recorded in the minutes so that becomes part of the record. Individually, yes. How each individual voted is to be part of the minutes. All right. So we're getting down to it. This is, again, a good general list from the Routt County, Colorado Planning Commission Handbook, which I thought was a good example. The responsibilities of the chair. Run the meeting. Everybody kind of figures that. Maintain order. Keep things moving. And maintain order, orderly process, and get things done, but get the business done. Manage the public testimony. That's an important factor, particularly if things get really crazy. That's an important role for the chair to play. Prevent arguments. Discussion is great, but we really don't want people to get into heated arguments. Everybody should make their case and state their points, but no point in having the arguments. The chair needs to understand parliamentary procedure, all of the things we just talked about, making motions, how to vote, what to do, and the order in which to do them. And just tie things together so that people have an understanding what it is that the Planning Commission has done and what their role and responsibility is, and move that forward. So, you are now ready to be the chair of the Planning Commission. Good luck. Any questions or comments as we wrap up here? Question in the back. Yeah.
So when it comes to new ordinances being written, what would the procedure be? And you have staff. Does the staff write the ordinance? And then present that to the Planning Commission? Does the Planning Commission first give instruction to staff and then they write the ordinance and then come back to Planning Commission? What is the procedure there?
I mean, it can really happen in a lot of different ways. A lot of times staff will make recommendations for changes to the ordinance as they've seen, they think, oh, this could work better. We've seen places where it works better, so they can propose something. Planning Commission members may propose, they say, hey, how about if we look at changing this? I went to a Planning Commission meeting someplace else and they did things this way. How about if we do something like that? So really, and then you can have individuals that apply to make changes to the code. It can come about in any number of ways. There's a lot of different ways, but when it actually comes before the Planning Commission as an agended item, then at that point where it's a code change, you're required to have a public hearing on it and then make a recommendation to the council as to whether to go with that change or not. And your role is recommending, not approving it.
Gee, you left out consultants providing
yeah.
this draft for you. That happens a lot. I really like the idea when it's a fairly significant ordinance that you have a joint meeting with the City Council and Planning Commission and talk through some of the issues in it. Because it's tough for everybody to, just see it once, kind of a thing for a public hearing. So at least a work session of some sort, and may as well invite the City Council too.
Now here's a fun aspect of things, because I've seen this happen before too. The council, somebody on the council comes up with an idea for an ordinance change, and they go to the council meeting and they say, hey, I think we ought to change our our land use code, our zoning ordinance, so that it'll allow this or it won't allow that. We need to change it. And the council members, other council members say, oh, okay, that's a good idea. Let's put it on the agenda and we'll vote on it at the next meeting. They can't do that.
Yeah.
Any change to your land use codes or regulations by state law must first receive a recommendation from the Planning Commission. So if a council member has an idea and the council says, oh, that's a good idea, let's think about doing that, it has to be sent to the Planning Commission first. The Planning Commission has to consider it through their process, which includes a public hearing, and then they make a recommendation to the council before the council can take any action on it.
And we didn't show on our agenda that you might have an item called Planning Matters, or stuff we want to work on down at the bottom or somewhere. Work session kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Because, you know, we sort of get stuck in processing. That's all we do, right? But we're also the planners for our city. So we got to remember, this is something we want to work on. I hate to go back to Salt Lake County. Sorry, Spencer. Wait a minute. Sorry, Wilf. But there were things that I saw when we were a township in Mill Creek that needed to be fixed, you know, and we just couldn't get them done. But those could have been on an agenda where we made a recommendation that we do some work on this, then have a public hearing, and send them on up to the county commission at that point, right? Anyway, I think a line item, stuff we need to work on, should be on your agenda too. So you're always doing something moving ahead.
Yeah, work sessions is a whole nother kind of a aspect of this, but they're a good idea. Allows you to just have, you know, good conversation about something that you want to look at doing in your community. Good thing to include. It's a public meeting, has to be open to the public, but, and you have to advertise it, make sure that the public knows about it, but, you know, it's freewheeling conversation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks so much. We're sorry we kept you so long. And again, thanks to the Ombudsman's Office for their funding of this. And thanks very much. And tell your friends to watch the video.